Hey math people, Mr. Ray here. This will be our last lesson on the factoring part of grade 10 math. So what we're going to do today, I mentioned at the end of last lesson, so we've wrapped up. We've had lessons on all the main factoring techniques. Hopefully you've got lots of practice on each of them. So what this lesson will do is kind of, I'm going to give you a flowchart on the next page that kind of gives you the decision-making process to determine which method should you use. Because up till now, every time you've had homework questions, it's always the same type of factoring. So once once we have a test on this, you're not going to get questions saying use this technique for these questions. It'll be you decide which technique is used. All the questions will be random. So you have to have a decision-making process that helps you determine which method to use. So got some basic definitions here. These should all be common knowledge for you at this point. And then the concepts. Now I've got 5 types of factoring. So common factoring, simple trinomial, complex trinomial, difference of squares, and the 5th one, factoring by grouping. This one was actually part of common factoring. This is when we had 4 terms, and you grouped the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms, and then common factored each. So in a way, it's kind of a special case of common factoring, but it's going to be considered its own technique in the flowchart. You'll see that in a second. And also, you'll see on the flowchart, always try, see capital letters, always try to common factor first, and then choose. See if there's another method you need to use. Just a reminder, you can always check your result of factoring by expanding. See if you get the original question. And let's go on to the flowchart. So the dark blue boxes, those are the techniques. So you can see at the tops, common factoring is something you should always try and see if it works. It may not work, but at least you've eliminated it as a potential method. You may common factor and then determine another method has to be used as well. Okay, so once you've common factored and you've you've factored out the common factor, then with what's left over, you see the next decision is based on how many terms do we have. Okay, so if it was 3 terms, it may be one of these types of factoring. You'd look to see if it has this basic model, x squared plus bx plus c, or a coefficient in front of the x squared. And this is going to be simple trinomial and complex trinomial. So as you flow through here, for example, you might have a question, you common factor out a 3, and once you've done that, you have left over something that looks like this, so then you'll do simple trinomial. Or maybe there's no common factor, but you come down here and you see it's this method. So you do complex trinomial, okay? So this one's pretty straightforward. This was like lessons 2 and 3, factoring methods 2 and 3. Now if there's 2 terms, it's possible that it could be a difference of squares. Difference of squares is always 2 terms. So you'd look to see if it is difference of squares using those that little checklist of 3 things. Is it 2 terms? Is there a subtraction sign? And can you take the square root of each of the 2 terms? Okay. Now, you may notice there's a little arrow that comes back on itself here. And that's because on some rare occasions, you might see a difference of squares. You might do the difference of squares. And maybe one of those factors, you could still do another difference of squares. So you'll see a couple of questions like that in the review practice questions I've attached to this. You also could see it on the test as a thinking question to see if you can get all the possible factors. Now, what happens maybe if you don't find? Maybe if you do the first difference of squares and you just stop there, well, everything you've done is right, but you haven't really finished. If you haven't, we call that fully factoring, which means nothing left over is factorable. So I see a lot of times maybe people don't do the common factoring, and they're left with something that is right if you expand it, but maybe you could have factored, you know, a 3 out from one of the factors. So if you see a question that says fully factor, that's usually a hint that maybe more than one factoring technique will be required. Okay, and then so that's 2 terms. Now, just because there's 2 terms doesn't mean it's going to be difference of squares. You're going to check to see if it is, just like you checked to see if it was 3 terms. If it's one of these, it's quite possible. Maybe you had 3 terms and there's a single common factor, and that's all you did. Maybe it was just common factoring. Maybe it was common factoring and one of these 2, or maybe you didn't have to common factor and it was one of these 2. Okay, so the only other choice of factoring we have is if there's 4 terms, and if there's 4 terms, this is where you do the factor by grouping, where you'd group the first 2 terms in brackets, third and fourth term in brackets, and then common factor each one. Okay, if you want to know, this would be in the common factoring lesson. Okay, so if you're wondering why didn't we have a lesson on this, it was within the common factoring. There's a few questions there and some in the homework. So I've got a couple of things for homework, a few questions from the textbook, and these are just kind of random factor these expressions to test your ability to use the flowchart and choose the right techniques. And then also I've got this handout. It looks a little bit like this. So there's over 100 questions here. I mean, how many you do is up to you. Do you want to be perfect at this? Do you want to be mediocre? Do you want to be really good? Depends on how many of these you actually attempt and answer correctly, obviously. The answers are on the bottom, so there's no complete solutions. Now, some of these, if I find one here, for example, this one here, you look at it, it's 3 terms. Now, is it, so you try to common factor, there's no common factor. Does it look like one of these 2? Well, sort of, if you look at the order's not correct, okay? So some of these you're going to have to rearrange in the right order. So for example, number 38 here, if you just change the order to x squared minus 10x plus 25, it would then fit into simple trinomial factoring, and you go from there. So if it looks like it's close, but maybe it's not quite in the right order, that's when you'll rearrange the questions so that it kind of fits the model more. And you'll see lots of questions, like for example, 4 terms here. So again, you're going to always try common factoring, and then in this case there is no common factor, but so you jump down to here, 4 terms, so then you're going to do factor by grouping, okay, and go from there. So you can see all these are kind of randomized as to the types, so it's really good practice to make sure you can kind of use this flowchart in your head, figure out the right technique, and then apply it correctly. Some of these are actually crossed off, and just to give you an idea, I also use this with my grade 12s. They've learned a couple other factoring techniques, which I've crossed off here because you haven't learned how to do that. Now, some of the questions can be tougher. Like if I go down to question 100, you probably haven't seen anything like that in your homework, but I want you to at least determine which method you would use and then attempt to factor it. Okay, if you can do these tougher questions like 97 or 100, that shows that you're pretty strong at this, and then you should feel pretty confident going forward with your abilities in factoring. Okay, so you've got a few questions from the textbook. You've got this practice problem handout, and that will show you where you stand with your ability to factor and go forward with that knowledge. Okay, so that's it for today, and we'll see you on the next lesson.